The climate summit enabled us to have some significant dialogue, right, on sort of what the underlying principles were going to be for what the climate was going to mean to the African continent.
Many of the resources that the world needs to effectively tackle climate change are on the African continent. So that's one big takeaway, the message. It's like we are not just victims, we are also actors, and we are ready to work with you to harness some of this potential. Other key messages were around, particularly around financing.
I do believe it left the country, the African continent in a much better position, but I think the challenge remains is for us to follow up on a lot of the commitments that were made. And when we look at the African Climate Summit, I think the outcomes there that were particularly interesting for built environment practitioners is the focus on a just energy transition. Being from South Africa, we know that 70% of the energy generation in this country comes from coal. So coal is very much linked to the livelihoods of local communities. And so the focus on just energy transition at the COP28 means that we will really take into account the impact of energy transition on these communities. So the other thing that I thought was particularly interesting from these climate negotiations, this is the African Climate Summit specifically, is the Global Community Pledge. So what you have is we've been having a series of COPs. I think we are on the 28th COP. Last year was the 28th COP. And the global community has been making pledges around loss and damage, around directing climate finance to the African region. And so when the African Union convened the ACS in Nairobi last year, they really elevated the issue of making sure we hold the global community accountable in terms of making sure we are tracking the pledges of climate finance that needs to come to this region to finance the energy transition. So I thought that was a key outcome that came from from the Nairobi Declaration on climate change that was convened by the African Union. When you look at how the ACS was convened just before COP and making sure that all the 54 member states met and agreed on specific policies, specific priorities, key priorities for the region, I think it meant stepping into a platform like a COP where we are negotiating with other countries around the globe. We were in a much stronger position as a continent because we were speaking with one voice. So I do believe it left the country, the African continent in a much better position. But I think the challenge that remains is for us to follow up on a lot of the commitments that were made at COP28, like many COPs.
The climate summit enabled us to have some significant dialogue, right, on sort of what the underlying principles were going to be for what the climate was going to mean to the African continent. In particular, I think that the action plans, and their presentation and some kind of tacit acceptance in terms of climate development for Africa were an important realization. I also think that some of the thematic areas in terms of being able to prioritize investment into financing, pledges, and the like for the African continent and its initiatives was an important thing that came out of the Africa Climate Summit.
One is the message. The message is that Africa is not just a victim. Africa has tremendous potential, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's the potential for food production, whether it's potential for critical minerals. Many of the solutions that the world needs, many of the resources that the world needs to effectively tackle climate change are on the African continent. So that's one big takeaway, the message. It's like we are not just victims, we are also actors, and we are ready to work with you to harness some of this potential. Other key messages were particularly around financing. Many African governments find themselves at the moment in difficult fiscal positions, which has compounded the difficulty around being able to mobilize the resources, particularly financing, to invest in adaptation, mitigation, and the bigger picture of developing a more sustainable approach to development. And within that, an important message that came out of Nairobi was an appeal to the international community to say that the global financial architecture, as it currently stands, is incompatible with the needs of African economies when it comes to the climate change fight, and that there is an urgent need to rework the global financial architecture to address things like debt sustainability on the continent, limited fiscal space, and of course, the need for much more private investment and private capital to go into the climate change and climate action space.